Okay, so there's a common assertion really that Marxism, as a set of ideas, can't really deal with the question of oppression, or even that it doesn't want to. You know, that Marx and Engels didn't really write much on, you know, the woman question or whatever you want to call it. You know, and that because of the kind of the accusation that Marxism is a kind of economic determinism, really. So it's just interested in the class struggle, in what happens in the workplace. And we really reduce all of human relationships down to just the class struggle. You know, there's bosses and workers, and that's the only important thing. And then on top of that, there can be a claim as well that because Marxists do look to an idea of workers' revolution as the thing that can bring about fundamental change in society, that it can be as if we're saying that's just going to solve all the problems and there's nothing else we need to worry about. You know, so you can have a revolution and after that everything will be fine, oppression will disappear, and so on. You know, and obviously those kind of accusations come from the right, from people who want to undermine struggle against capitalism and from people who just detest left-wing ideas or radical ideas. But it can also come from people who are genuinely on the left and who want to struggle, want to fight oppression, fight against exploitation, but feel frustrated, you know, or say that Marx and Engels didn't really look at oppression. So I think it's really important that, really, I mean, in the last few years certainly, but over the last generation, there's been a number of serious attempts to look at Marxism, the Marxist canon, if you like, the works of Marx and Engels themselves and later Marxists, and look at what they had to say about oppression, and specifically in this case, about women's oppression. So there are writers like Lisa Fogel and Martha Gimenez who are, you know, have produced works that are about looking at what Marx and Engels really had to say on women's oppression. There's a book that just came out last year by a Canadian academic called Heather Brown, called Marx on Gender in the Family, which is due out in paperback this month, hopefully soon to hit the UK, which is a really serious study that adds to, you know, previous work that was done 30, 40 years ago, that goes through looking at all of Marx and Engels' works, really, particularly Marx in this case, and really looking at everything they said about the role of women in society, about the role of the family, you know, the role of women and men in production and reproduction. You know, and she really, I think, proves very clearly that Marx and Engels had a lot to say about women's oppression. You know, so that's an important starting point. But I think inside of those kind of Marxist accounts or Marxist feminist accounts of Marx and Engels on women's oppression, there's quite often a bit of a kind of a dismissal or a kind of taking down in importance of the book that I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is Friedrich Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. As you can see, it's a relatively small book, you know, because that includes an introduction and several prefaces and so on. You know, this isn't a massive magisterial study on the on the scale of Marx's Capital that looks at in intricate detail peeling away the layers of a whole social system and a whole set of relations between human beings. But what it does do is try to put a polemical argument about the material roots of oppression and therefore kind of drawing conclusions from that, political conclusions about how we fight oppression. So I want to look really at that book, at some of the arguments and also at some of the criticisms of it and the problems and see whether we think it is something that's still useful to look at, and obviously I certainly do think it is. So Friedrich Engels was someone who worked and organised and theorised with Marx throughout his life. He wrote The Origin of the Family in 1884, which was a year after Marx had died, and it was based on notes that Marx had made, as well as Engels' own work, on an American anthropologist called Lewis Henry Morgan, who'd written a book called what it was called now, Ancient Society. And of course, I'm calling him an anthropologist, you know, this was a very new thing at that time. It was really just starting to be a new science, the idea of studying human history in this way. Of course, Darwin had published The Origin of Species in 1859, you know, this is just 25 years later that Engels is writing. And it's not just the kind of the science side of it, if you like. Engels was also basing his work, looked at the history of the family in terms of another study that much less important in terms of its impact, but important in terms of the history of having a historical analysis of the family. Because Engels said that there was really no history of the family before 1861. And in 1861, a book was published by a Swiss kind of classical philosopher, really, called Bachofen. And he wrote this book called Mother Rights, which really was a study of the kind of myths and stories of ancient societies, particularly ancient Greece. And he looked at their kind of mythologies and how they changed through time, how the stories that they were telling kind of transformed, and told a story about what kind of transformation might be taking place in society as well. So he literally looks at myths, you know, stuff like the Oedipus and all of those kind of things that we might have heard of. And I can't remember the particular story it is, but there's one in which, you know, a young man kills his mother because she has murdered her husband. And the old gods, the old furies, avenging angels, go after the son instantly. You know, that's the worst crime in the world, killing your mother. And then the new gods are like, well, hold on a minute, let's have a court case, because maybe it's not the worst thing. You know, he needed to avenge the death of his father. And in the end, the new gods win. And Bachofen kind of sees this as like a struggle that's taking place in society, shifting from an old idea of, you know, the worst, you know, the most important bond, the one that our society is kind of built around, is the one that comes from the mother line, you know, the one that comes through those kind of old kinship relationships where the mother is at the centre of them, and it's transforming into a newer system where the father becomes the key figure in the family. You know, so for the old gods, you know, you can't kill your own blood relation, your mother, the one that is the certain blood relation. Whereas for the son and for the new gods, the idea of killing your husband or your father is the worst thing that can happen. You know, and so it's a historical analysis of the family, but it's completely idealistic. It's just looking at the kind of ideas of society and how they've changed, and then trying to draw something about society from them. And Engels wanted to turn that on its head, really. You know, and then when he and Marx read Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, which was a study of some of the kind of hunter-gatherer societies, some of the groups of people who were living in North America at the time of, you know, early colonialism, really, in America. Engels found really a kind of material evidence for the kind of arguments that him and Marx had been developing about how human societies had developed and how relations between human beings might have changed through time. Now, Morgan's great strength really was his attempt to look at human history through successive stages of development of the productive forces. You know, he focuses really on what kind of tools societies had, you know, how they organised production, you know, what kind of horticulture or agriculture or hunting and gathering, etc., different tribes and different societies had. And he looked at the social relationships that went with those different methods of meeting their needs. So he looked at kinship relationships between people. And Engels, you know, building on Marx's insights really in his anthropological notebooks, developed these kind of studies that Morgan did into a theory of how it was the rise of class society that brought with it really the development of the family in more the form that we understand it, and that brought with it women's oppression as well. Now, of course, there are those in mainstream kind of academia and in anthropology who have dismissed Morgan's findings, you know, and therefore dismissed Engels as well, as being outmoded and therefore not really to be relied on. Now, there's certainly, you know, a case for saying that there's things about the evidence they based their work on that is outmoded, that is wrong, that is, you know, not as rigorous as you would later find when there's more evidence being found, more studies being done, and so on. You know, again, this was the very early days of the whole idea of anthropology, really. And Hal Draper, who's a Marxist writing in about 1970, pointed out that the issue isn't really the detail, this or that detail of Morgan's work that modern anthropologists in the 50s and 60s were criticising. You know, in that respect you can criticise Darwin and Newton as well, because their evidence could also be outmoded. The issue that modern anthropologists in the middle of the 20th century had was with the method, that Morgan had and that Engels drew the conclusions from, and its revolutionary implications. So Draper argues that to say that Engels is rejected by modern anthropologists is as true as the statement that Marx is rejected by modern sociologists. And we all know why modern sociologists reject Marx, really, even though he keeps on coming back. And so The Origin of the Family, like I say, it's not an extensive study. It's a short book. It summarises Morgan's findings, and then alongside it, it puts a kind of polemical argument about the nature of, so-called primitive society, about the rise of private property, and with it, the emergence of classes and the state. And so he goes through, we tend to focus on the earlier chapters, which deal with the family, kind of the transition to a class society, and what Engels calls the historic defeat of the female sex. But he also then goes on to look at the rise of the state in ancient Greece and Rome, among Germanic peoples after the fall of the Roman Empire, and other stuff as well. So, so I think that central to the process that he's trying to describe is a profound downward shift, really, in the social status of women that's rooted in the development of the family, out of those older kinship relationships of the kind that Morgan was looking at. So Engels argues that for the vast majority of human existence, which is something like 130, 150,000 years, or 2.5 million years if you include, earlier kind of human type species, people have lived in small communities that were relatively egalitarian. They didn't contain systematic oppression by one group of another. Concepts like private property, wealth, inheritance, and so on wouldn't have had any kind of meaning in those societies. They were nomadic groups largely, or hunting and gathering societies that wouldn't really have been able to keep any wealth, build up stocks and so on. Because people hadn't yet learned how to cultivate plants to any great extent, how to rear animals, these hunter-gatherer societies could sustain only a relatively small population, which would then have to move on if resources became scarce. And so a kind of idea of communal living really was common sense in the most basic sense of that expression. In order to maintain the small population that you have to share, you have to look after each other, you have to make sure that everyone has a role, that everyone is playing their role. So there may well have been division of labour between different groups in that group, for example, between men and women. But that didn't mean the domination of one group by another, or hierarchies inside of that group, or rather elites, emerging inside of that group. A lot of the societies that were studied in the 20th century and earlier, these kind of hunting and gathering societies that existed into the 20th century, they would find that people generally made decisions about the things they were involved in. It wasn't that people were ordered about what to do, but that everyone felt they had some part of the decision-making process. And rather than living in family units in the way that we would often think of them, a unit of two parents and their children, there were rather kind of systems of kinship which expressed the relationships of everyone to each other. It's a way of understanding everyone's role, understanding who's related to who really, and understanding, your kind of position in that society. So there could be a kind of, a sense that there was a responsibility on everyone to look after children, for example. That there was a kind of choice in sexual relationships for men and women that would become alien in later societies, really, where we start to see monogamy and marriage as being the main forms of relationships. And this isn't to argue that this was some kind of utopia, that existed before the fall, because sometimes people will represent Engels as like falling into this tradition of like Rousseau, who was an Enlightenment thinker, left-wing kind of Enlightenment thinker, who'd kind of almost saw, the rise of like class society, private property, things like that as the fall of man, in a kind of biblical reference. Like we were living in this lovely Garden of Eden in equality and community, and then we got, knowledge culture, society, civilization so-called, and all of that, and everything really went downhill. But I do think it's fair to say that there was a profoundly different set of values, and that, of course, looking at hunting and gathering societies that existed into the 20th century, you can't just say this is exactly how things would have been for people in Europe 10,000 years ago. But I think it is reasonable to draw some conclusions about, the traces of that kind of society that might still be visible in societies that hadn't developed in the way that things did in Europe and so on, and then spreading out across the rest of the world. I think it was really in Engels' time when you're starting to see colonialism, capitalism is expanding and people are going out to different parts of the world and coming into contact with these kind of societies that are very different from what you have had for a couple of thousand years really in Europe. And so this is where you start to get these studies that are done of people like the Naskapi Indians in eastern Canada. And so there's this well-known quote that I'm sure many people have heard. It's a report from the 1630s of a French Jesuit missionary who's visiting eastern Canada. And he's just horrified at what he finds there in terms of the way that people live. It seems so alien to him because women seem to have all this kind of autonomy. They have choice over their sexual partners. Men look after babies while women are working. It's this horrific place that he can't really get his head around. And he goes up to one of the men and says, in France, women do not rule their husbands. I told him it was not honourable for a woman to love anyone except her husband, and that this evil being among them, he himself was not sure that his son, who was there present, was his son. But the Naskapi replied, thou hast no sense. I wonder if he really said that. You French people love only your own children, but we love all the children of our tribe. It was a completely different set of values from what existed really in, let's call it very early capitalist Europe. And so, in The Origin of the Family, Engels uses terms that that Morgan uses to describe the broad development of different stages of human societies. So the first is savagery, and that is hunting, gathering, kind of nomadic societies. And then comes barbarism, which is horticultural and early agricultural societies, more settled, some more ability to kind of cultivate food and so on. And then finally civilization, which is really, developed at a high level of agriculture, farming, irrigation and so on, the beginnings of the development of cities, and the kind of things that Engels describes about, ancient Greece, for example, and so on. And these are very much class societies, where you can clearly see a division between a minority who own and control wealth in society and a majority who do the labour on their behalf. And then he also looks at kind of corresponding forms of marriage, that Morgan has identified, and I think there's definitely some question about how true these forms are, how accurate. But the way that Engels describes it is really that you see a kind of successive levels of exclusion of who you're allowed to partner with, and that relationships get brought down from a relative level of choice and changing around and freedom in relationships to pairing to settling, and then the patriarchal family that he describes in ancient Greece of the most vicious form, where women really are treated like utter rubbish, treated like slaves inside of the family, and the family includes, in fact, of course, the wife, the children, and the slaves are owned by the paterfamilias. That this is the beginning of the more modern form of monogamy. And of course, he points out monogamy didn't mean monogamy for the husband. Of course, it always meant monogamy for the wife, who had to be faithful to her husband to make sure that there were heirs that he could be certain were his. But for the husband, it was always supplemented, as Engels put it, by prostitution and affairs and so on. And so, I think for Engels, this isn't a reversal of some kind of previous state of matriarchy, a bit like the kind of thing that I think Bachofen was describing in his book, that there's this idea that previously women were in control and then men had a meeting and decided to turn the tables, really. But that the old kinship system centred around the mother, this was because it was only the mother, whether you were able to be definite of who their children were. These days you could do a paternity test. In those days, mother generally knew who her children were, and thus you could build up a kind of network of blood relationships around that knowledge. So every member of the group has a place, a line of descent, a role, responsibilities and duties that go with that. And it means that everyone has a part in that community. And so the household wasn't, the mother and the father of children living together. In fact, mostly the rules were that they'd be in separate households because, households were largely communal. They were organised around those kind of bloodlines and so on. And they were places of work, really. They were open places of work where the work of both men and women would have contributed and been shared among families. And so the new male-dominated family that Engels talks about growing up really kind of breaks up this intricate communal system and places the individual family as the kind of key economic unit in society in a different way. It becomes the means through which wealth can be owned and passed on. Rather than just really being a kind of set of social relationships, it becomes an economic unit as well. And rather than the woman being an equally important economic actor in society, she and her children become dependent upon the man, or seen as belonging to the man. And that's something I'll come back to. I think because what had changed, according to Engels, is people's ability to produce more than they immediately need to consume. And so the development of agriculture and domestication of animals and all of these things meant that you were able to produce enough to settle, enough to store some, enough to be able to, plan ahead and so on. You're able to free up some people from daily work to study the seasons, to, understand more about how you can control nature, how you can get more out of it. Simpler tools develop into more specialised tools. Property, which before would have been something that didn't have very much kind of value in modern kind of terms, but something that was useful, becomes more and more important. The plough or whatever that your family owns becomes extremely important in terms of producing wealth for your family. And it tended to be the men who were ones responsible for the animal rearing and increasingly for agriculture. And it was them who owned the tools, therefore, and made the economic decisions, gradually kind of increasing their relative power over women in those communities. And so, in a way, it's a continuation of the old way of people being, responsible for making decisions for the things that they were in charge of, now becomes something that excludes women, because less and less are they in charge of things, less and less do they get to make the decisions. And so for the first time, women's ability to give birth becomes a burden. And that's partly because settled communities, with greater productive capacity, can sustain a larger population. You can settle down, you can have more children because you don't have to carry them around if you have to move and so on. And of course, you need more labourers, as it happens, to work in the fields to produce more stuff in an agricultural society. So women would tend to spend more time pregnant or with young children, and therefore, again, excluded from production in various ways. But this in itself isn't the main source of women's oppression. If you read Ellen Burt Leacock's introduction to The Origin of the Family, which you can't get in print at the moment, but you can find it online. She's the author of a book called Myths of Male Dominance, which I think we've got at the back as well. And she talks about how, really, what changed in terms of women's status was precisely this hiving off of the family from the communal clan. This change in what the family is really about. And so women's labour in the home becomes this kind of service. And, and they become subjects, really, in a relationship of subjugation to men increasingly. And this is the world historic defeat of the female sex that Engels writes about. And I'll quote you here from Engels. So he says, "The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became a slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This degraded position of women has gradually been palliated and glossed over and sometimes clothed in milder terms. in mild form, sorry. In no sense has it been abolished. You know, so again, he's being historical here. He's saying something happened at this point in history, and it's now, you know, it brings in a new epoch, really, that we're still living in, effectively, with some important changes. He quotes from Marx as well. He says, so Marx's notes, he wrote, the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, but also serfdom, since from the beginning it is related to agricultural services. It contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extend throughout society and its state. And so, you know, this is an important moment in history. And when I say moment, I mean that in the sense that it took place over hundreds or thousands of years in different ways in different places, but a historical moment in terms of a transformation of human relationships. That Marx and Engels both look to in terms of something fundamental transforming in human relations, not just in terms of the family and relations between women and men, but all relationships in society. That it's the first time that you get class societies developing where some people own and control of wealth and others have to work to produce it. You know, so this is a profound change in human relations that isn't caused by some kind of latent desire in men to dominate over women. It's caused by the needs of production, really, and the way that those developed. And so Engels says that the monogamous family is the first form of the family to be based on economic conditions, on the victory of private property over communal property. And so, you know, they talk about the position of women in the family in terms of slavery. And I think if you look at societies like ancient Greece, the kind of stuff that Engels describes, you know, you can see that this is not an exaggeration in terms of the position of women. And again, this is something where, Engels, I think, suggests that if things hadn't been so different before, it wouldn't have been necessary to smash women so hard inside the patriarchal family, like 2,000 years ago in Greece and so on, or whatever it was. And so there's, this is a profound change that opens up a period that has lasted until today. It's a period in which, as Engels says, every step forward is also a step backward. It's a period in which prosperity and development for some is won through the misery and frustration of others. That is what class society does, and that's still what it does today, really. And so I guess I want to look at some of the criticisms, really, in the last few minutes. And I think, for some Marxists, particularly Martha Gimenez, for example, who writes very clearly and very well about Engels and the importance of it, really defends him against a lot of the attacks that there are on Marxists and so on, and really defends the origin of the family. But one of the things that she thinks is weak about it is the whole idea of looking for origins, really. She thinks that, Marxists are historical materialists, and that to her means looking at the structures of society and historical development and so on, and not looking back for some kind of distant past that we can't really definitely know about, and kind of looking for some kind of mystical origin of, of things like oppression or whatever. But I think that, I think Engels' method is sound, and I think there is something very important about understanding the development of class society as a profound transformation in human society. I think it's absolutely right to look at the detail of history and look at facts and so on. And I think there's definitely, things that can be pointed out that are factually incorrect about some of the anthropology, as I mentioned before. But there's also a whole wealth of anthropology, and studies that have been done since that I think back up the general argument that Engels is putting about earlier human societies. There's a massive amount of evidence about, the generally egalitarian kind of hunter-gatherer societies before the rise of class divisions and so on. Now, Gimenez isn't actually criticising Engels on the front of his anthropological evidence. She doesn't think that that's the thing that's lacking. But she thinks that, really looking back, you can't look for the origins in some kind of distant past. But I think that what Engels does is use the available evidence that is just really coming to light and just starting to be studied, and says that we can identify a process that fundamentally changed human existence and ushered in this new era, really, of class struggle that we still live in. You know, it's something that took place over many thousands of years in lots of different ways, but it is something that took place, and it's important to identify it and to say that there was something that shifted in human beings, in human society. You know, that we certainly do exist inside of structures. You know, we have structures in society in which human beings live, but they're also structures that are made by human beings. They're, you know, what Engels is doing is trying to identify how human beings made class society, how they, you know, and why, and how it's changed and how it's developed through time. You know, and crucially for Engels, I think, how human beings struggle to change those structures that really are the residue of kind of, you know, the actions of earlier human beings. And I think one of the most common criticisms of Engels is economic determinism. So some people who certainly do look to Marx, you know, and this is certainly clear in Heather Brown's book, you know, see in Marx really a kind of humanism, something about human emancipation that includes women inside of it, that can give us a tool to really understanding how human beings can emancipate themselves. But then they look to Engels' work and don't see the same thing there. I think some of Brown's argument comes from an earlier thinker, an American Marxist called Raya Dunayevskaya, who was really best known for kind of founding humanist Marxism, as it was called in the US in the 50s. You know, this is like a generation of people really who broke from Stalinism, who broke from that kind of dead hand of the idea that, you know, there's just this inevitable progress in history towards socialism and human beings just need to wait for the party to deliver it, really. And so she looked back to Marx and with an interest in human emancipation, but similarly didn't like Engels. And she argued that you know, Marx saw human action really as the driving force of history, but Engels just talks about these stages. You know, I mentioned the stages that Morgan talked about and that Engels also uses. You know, and I think that, you know, so Dunayevskaya looks to the evidence, some of the evidence really in Marx's anthropological notebooks, and says, look, there is evidence of some male domination before class societies arise, you know, which Engels doesn't seem to talk about. And you know, so really, can we say that there's this kind of idea of primitive communism that Engels talks about, this, you know, great time before the fall, as they say, you know, that you can see some evidence in Marx's notes of this, but not in Engels. And I think what she does is kind of, partly she downplays the extent to which Engels really did rely on Marx's notes to a large degree. You know, this wasn't just Engels' work, this was bringing together work of two people who worked together for 40 years. But also I think that in looking for nuance, you know, in looking for detail and so on, she ends up really not being able to see the wood for the trees, because you end up missing the fundamental shift that took place in human society, that went from no class, no elites, you know, no major division in society, to class society and class struggle really for the rest of human society. And that, you know, something fundamental transforms. It doesn't mean that there were no kind of complications or, you know, intricacies going on as part of that process. So again, looking to Bert Leacock in her introduction to the book, she talks about how the stages that Engels talks about are a conceptual framework, really. They're a way of thinking about history. They're not just trying to retrospectively impose, you know, as kind of inevitability onto something that is obviously a very complex process. And so for her, you know, some examples of male dominance, for example, however that may be defined, before class society, doesn't invalidate the categories that that Engels talks about. It shows that there's a complex process of transition from one to the other, you know, and also that there's a difference between examples of a thing happening between individuals and systematic oppression, which is what Engels is talking about. So I don't think Engels ever claims that there's some kind of straightforward one-way relationship between the development of the productive forces and the social relations in society. You know, he's talking about the battles that take place, and I think when you read the book, it's weird to read, because it's not like, you know, reading Communist Manifesto or something. It's quite a lot of detail about strange societies, you know, Germanic peoples that I hadn't particularly thought about before, and the way they relate to each other and so on. And it's precisely because he's looking at, the really complex ways that human societies develop and change. And I think it's worth quoting him again, actually, in terms of this historical materialist approach. He says it's not that the economic situation is cause solely active, while everything else, and by that he means political, philosophical, religious development and so on, is only passive effect. There is rather interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. So for Engels, there's a historic defeat, because there's something fundamental that changes in the economic base of society, and that brings about changes in human relations. We develop ways to produce a surplus, not because of nature's bounty, but by our own labour. So, and this is different. It's different from even being a hunting and gathering society that lives in a place that happens to be very plentiful and you don't really have lack. You might live somewhere where there's lots of fish. It doesn't mean that your social relations become, transform in that way, really. There's something about, a human society that in itself has to develop the tools, develop the ways of agriculture and so on, in order to produce a surplus which someone then feels they've produced, that someone then owns. And I think it's wrong to try and separate out Engels and Marx to the degree that some people do, therefore, to try and show Engels as a reductionist and Marx as a great humanist. And so I think there's I guess two more things I want to mention about the book, because there are a couple of passages in The Origin of the Family that really do show it up as a Victorian piece of work, things that are kind of offensive to the modern ear. There's a bit when Engels is talking about ancient Greece, where he talks about men degrading themselves through the abominable practice of sodomy. And he's talking about a divided society. And as I've already mentioned, he's talking about the way that women are so degraded in that society that they're not even really considered human beings that are worthy of having a relationship with. And he's making the point that, human relations are so degraded that men degrade themselves too, by refusing to treat women as equals, really. All sexuality is distorted by this society, but it's absolutely the case that, no socialist should use that kind of language. And after a kind of movement that was really just beginning in its germs in Germany at that time, actually in the 1880s, I guess, the first homosexual rights movements were developing there at that time. And it shows, how much difference it makes, the actions that people take, the campaigns that are for, how they can shift the terrain of a debate and rid us really of those kind of ideas. I think also, there's a thing about Engels' own opinions on relationships that he talks about towards the end of the book. He kind of says, well, surely, a kind of genuine monogamy is what we'd all want after socialism. A genuine monogamy for the man and for the woman. And I think, well, obviously that's debatable. People might want all kinds of different relationships after socialism. And, he's been criticised for that, but this is really just his opinion. It's opinion that he's putting, and he doesn't claim that it's the logical outcome of the theory that he's been putting, really, and I think it's important to say. And so again, there's a quote that people may have seen before, but I think it's worth saying, because this is really his point about human relationships. He says, what we can now conjecture about the way in which sexual relations will be ordered after the impending overthrow of capitalist production is mainly of a negative character, limited for the most part to what will disappear. But what will there be new? That will be answered when a new generation has grown up. A generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man for any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of the economic consequences. When these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody thinks today they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. This is his vision, I think, of a future kind of society. So I think that what Engels does in the book, in a polemic, is show that in pre-class societies, class division, exploitation and oppression arose out of a natural necessity, really, out of the needs of trying to develop the productive forces further, to improve things for people. the productive forces just couldn't develop without freeing up some people from labour in order to exploit others. But capitalism is different from that. We still live in the epoch of class society and class struggle that he talks about, but something, again, has fundamentally shifted in terms of our potential as a society, because class today isn't necessary. Class today is not required in order to meet the needs of humanity, and actually it does the opposite. Capitalism doesn't meet people's needs, it holds us back. Class today is a result of past human activity, as Chris Harman put it, having congealed into a system which now constrains human activity. But it also creates a situation in which socialism is possible for the first time. It's a situation in which, for the first time in human history, we could have an egalitarian communal society where everyone can be fed and clothed and housed and have those kind of choices and autonomy over their lives that goes way beyond anything so-called primitive peoples actually ever had. It's not about going back for Engels, it's about going forward to a situation of real choice, real democracy and real kind of power over our own existence as individuals, but inside of a society.
Sense, and it's very nice to be called a gentleman. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important to defend Engels, especially in the light of the 2 articles in the journal that we've got at the moment for attacking Engels. Last year, some German comrades spoke to me when I spoke on Engels elsewhere. They said, Lionel, primitive communism is not the right term, it's communism. I've not read the German, and I'm not even sure if they were translating correctly for me, but their argument was, if you use in English the term primitive communism, we've got the wrong idea, because we use things like simple societies, small societies, not complex, perhaps not fully human, perhaps, in our mind, that's what we do. Whereas if we use the word communism, we're getting back to an original, mother communism, to which, as Marx and Engels would have said, we will return to when we make communism in the future. The communism in the future is going to be returned to the original egalitarianism of what we call primitive communism. So it's that important to us. And the issue is, how do we make that argument, and how do we defend that argument? Because clearly we've got 2 articles in the journal that are convinced all of this is wrong. Which is astounding, because it's a tenet of Marxism, a dialectical argument that there's going to be a return in history through our next revolution to the original revolution. So we have to be clear about how to make this argument. Last month in Liverpool, there was a conference of anthropologists called the Hunter-Gatherer Conference, where they are confirming the arguments of Engels, using the most up-to-date anthropology, the most up-to-date, biology, in which they are arguing that now we can tell from sub-Saharan Africans in the Paleolithic that they were matrilineal and matrilocal, which is the key organisational presence for primitive communism in the book by Engels. It's an organisation in which brothers and sisters who claim the same descent through a line of mothers live together in what Morgan called the Communistic Household. So just imagine yourself as a man, all go man in your head, and I'll be quick, and then visit your prospective wife in the matrilineal clan, and she is surrounded by her sisters, her mothers and her brothers. On what behaviour are you? You're on the very best behaviour. This is how the communistic household works, and how it means that there's going to be no systematic violence or whatever against a woman in an organisation of matrilineal clans. It's when those clans start breaking down that we get all the crap, all the bestiality, all the reversal, and the emergence of private property. But the point about communism is that Paleolithic hunter-gatherers didn't need to store, didn't need to produce, because you're in a time of mass plenty, of mass big game animals. You're in a Garden of Eden for hunters. That went 10,000 years ago. So when we're looking at contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures, we're looking at societies that are existing under adverse conditions, and therefore they accommodate to all sorts of reversals that take place very slowly over thousands of years. With the rise of agriculture, we get the rise of classes.
Well done.
I don't know if anybody saw the exhibition at the British Museum recently about Ice Age art, which was utterly astounding. I actually went back twice because it was so amazing, actually. But one thing that really strikes you about that exhibition was that there was all this art. It was going back sort of 30,000, 40,000 years at the sort of latest. and huge numbers of little statuettes of basically women in various stages of fertility. You know, there's some of women as sort of young women waiting to have children. There were some of women just heavily pregnant and sort of older crones and whatever. And also the most amazing art. You know, just carved on antlers, utterly delicate, and then quite often just literally broken up and chucked away. Often as sort of, as far as you can tell, obviously you're speculating, a sort of, you know, a kind of ritual sacrifice. But I think what really strikes you looking at these things is how utterly central the role of women as the matriarchy was to that kind of society. You know, there's animal figures. I don't think there was a single male figure in that exhibition. And yet there was this astounding celebration of women as fertile beings, but also in an incredibly beautiful sense. And I think that says quite a lot about early societies. It also did, though, suggest that, which I think is something that Lana just talked about, as though societies weren't the same. And, you know, and also that there were degrees of specialisation. You know, there was a bit of debate about whether antlers, for example, were carved by men or women. Yet if you read kind of conventional accounts, it'll be the male showman or the male artist sitting down and carving and going into the caves and doing all the paintings. And, you know, because a lot of those caves are very deep, very, very deep for probably ritualistic reasons. And I think it was a really interesting exhibition because I think it did, you know, point out that, you know, that primitive society wasn't ever... Sorry, wrong word. You're right. Wasn't people just sitting around all doing the same thing? There were divisions of labour. There were different types of conditions under which you were living. And I think that's the other thing. Hunter-gatherer societies, if they're living under very harsh conditions, may have quite strict divisions of labour because they need that to survive. Whereas actually, if you've got somewhere a lot easier, a more temperate or tropical climate, you're unlikely to find life easier generally, and therefore you react differently. And I think that specificity about earlier societies is really important, rather than the sort of general vague that was all communism. Final comment, which I'm not really quite sure about that, because if we have a socialist society in the future, how could we say, in what sense could you say it was like an early communist society? Because I just think the degree of technology and possibilities would make it totally different, although hopefully you would get a return to less distorted human relations. So.
Yes, I wrote one of the articles in the ISJ that the first speaker referred to. I mean, I'm a bit baffled to find that I've written an attack on Engels, because I was under the impression I was debating with Sheila. And I certainly take the view that The Origin of the Family is a very important book. That it's historically important because it demonstrates that the history of the family and women's oppression exists. So these things aren't things that are rooted in biology. These aren't things which have always existed. That it's clear from the evidence that there was the egalitarian past that I think Sally mentioned. It's also very interesting when you look at history that actually what Engels does is that he inverts what Morgan says about the history of women. Morgan claims that the position of women in society gets better as time goes on and poses modern America as good as it's going to get. In fact, Engels says that it's in quote-unquote primitive societies that women have the highest status. So that's a very interesting inversion of the accepted of the accepted ideas at the time. So I think, yeah, Engels' book is important. I think that Brown and Fogel go too far in dismissing it in the way that they do, though their books are very interesting and useful. I think there are some problems, we have to be honest, with Engels' book, and they aren't so much with the evidence as with the method that Engels adopts, because Engels had written in the Communist Manifesto with Marx that the history of society is the history of class struggle. You actually look at what Engels talks about as to how society changes in Origin of the Family, then he talks about social change following directly from technological change. He has a sort of, I mean, he himself uses the word Darwinist idea that of the evolutionary advantages of the exclusion of incest is something, and this is where the thing about same-sex stuff comes in. It isn't just that it isn't just the incidental homophobia. It's that he sees heterosexual monogamy as a kind of final goal of the whole process. So, for example, in passing, he describes medieval monasteries as unnatural. Because they're outside of that kind of way of living. So I think that there are some difficulties with Engels' method, which shouldn't lead us to reject the whole book. I just wanted to refer to the debate in the ISJ, because what I think Engels is doing is putting forward Marxist ideas, using the evidence of his time in the best way that he can. And I think that we have to continue with that tradition in the way that we debate about Marxism. And I think, I came to this having written stuff and researched stuff about LGBT politics for a long time. And it does seem to me that what Engels is doing when he says marriage changes and sexuality changes is very similar to what some people in the LGBT movement are saying when they talk about sexuality being socially constructed. And this actually is something which we've stolen more or less from French historians like Foucault and made part of our Marxist understanding of sexuality for the last 15 or 20 years. And what I felt is that we have to understand that there are all kinds of problems with Foucault, there are all kinds of problems with the queer theory which you come across, which is based on his ideas. But I think that when people are using those ideas in what I think is a very useful way to look at the history of sexuality, we can take some of those insights and we can incorporate them into Marxism. And I think that we have to take the most useful insights from non-Marxist ideas, reject the non-Marxist bits, but that actually it's possible to do that, and it's possible to have a dialogue with some of this very interesting work that's being done. I think that was one of my main debates with Sheila. The other thing was that I felt the evidence that she was making assertions that weren't justified by the evidence. But I think that we have to continue to develop Marxism in that way.
Hi, I don't want to be unpopular, but I just want to ask a couple of questions. In a future where we have a socialist society, given that we live in such big groups, how do we, I understand all of the dialectics, I understand what you're saying about Engels and Marx, but how do we transfer this idea of living in small societies where you can have those equal ideals to a society that we live in today with the technology we have? And I, as a modern woman, I'm really trying my hardest, but I don't see this ideal where suddenly all men are going to become wonderful again, because I just don't see that happening. I mean, I'm new to all of this, so if you could explain a bit about that would be good. And another thing I think is that I wonder if there isn't anyone could enlighten me on the impact of religion in this, because if you look at ancient biblical societies, for example, they are about as sexist as you can get. And I think that we need to have a whole argument about this, and the whole debate needs to be put forward. And there was one other thing that I should probably share. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm actually glad that Lyle posed it as the way he did about the articles in the journal, because in fact I'm going to disagree with you, Colin, because in fact if you look at the early writings of Marx, and the whole of Marxism and Engels' ideas are rooted in how we as biological beings emerge into becoming human beings. We are biological beings, and we don't have any problem at all in terms of saying in order to live our existence we have to eat, drink and do various things, but how we do that is shaped by the society we live in. So we didn't have McDonald's when we were living in a communist society. The kind of way we eat, the kind of way we drink, the way we relate to one another, the way we dress, the way we decorate ourselves and so on and so forth is part and parcel of how society develops. And in exactly the same way that we actually also have biological instincts for reproduction. That without the biological instinct of, to actually mate, sexual instincts, we wouldn't be on the planet and we wouldn't have developed the way we did. And therefore the question of how that is socialised, how it emerges, is just as much a factor of the development of historical materialist methodology as the way you actually understand the rest of how we live our lives. And this is no more difficult than that. That's the first point. And to deny it is actually to collapse into idealism. And there's no question about it that people like Judith Butler and Foucault and all the rest of it are idealists, and we actually should not be collapsing into that. So the second point that I really want to make is I think it is enormously important to defend Engels for there's a couple of other reasons I won't go into. But in actual fact, the problem with the people like Jimenez and Fogel is that really they're Althusserian Marxists. They start from structuralism. They do not start as we do, Marx and Engels do, the tradition we've actually built on it. And if you go back to Chris Harman's article, which reviews Engels 10 or 15 years ago, whenever he did it, is actually to look at the latest research. Now, Lionel is referred to in terms of hunter-gatherer societies and actually tracing that back. I haven't
haven't been doing much reading of it recently, but what fascinated me is the research 10 to 15 years ago, which showed actually that could trace through in the area of Mesopotamia the shift from a kind of hunter-gatherer society to horticultural society through the development of cities and therefore the development of civilization. That can be historically traced. And it is very, very important that we reclaim that. We also have to renew it as our knowledge increases. But it is a historical question which we can take into as part of our tradition.
Yeah, I wanted to start to come back on that question that was asked, because I think that's a pretty crucial question, really, about where we're going and how we're going to get there. And is it just an idealistic look? I just think that's a crucial question, which is going to take more than 3 minutes. My understanding of differences between the roles of men and women also varied according to where the food came from in ancient society. For example, in societies like in the Arctic, where the only source of food was large animals, so the only people who could actually go and get it were fit and able, not bearing children, able to go on long hunts for 3 or 4 days to bring back a seal or a walrus or a polar bear or whatever it was. And there you did get an imbalance, a very strong imbalance between the status of men and women. Whereas in other societies, where the role of other people in the tribe to drive herds over the cliffs or to go gathering small animals and so on, there was much more equality between the genders, even before the advent of class society. And that comes up to the present day, where in some industries, which are sort of exclusively men, I'm thinking of like mining, for example, in the mining communities, you would get this great discrepancy between the role and status of the man and the sort of sexist ideas about women, whereas in more sort of small industry areas, the ideas would be much more egalitarian. The ideas in our heads come from the conditions in which we live. It's not the other way around. And when we start to transform them, the ideas become transformed. So the process of men changing their ideas quickly, when you think about what we've got to do to make a revolution, we're going to have to smash the state. We're going to have to take on the police. We're going to have to overthrow the bosses who bully us every day. We're going to have to transform just about everything. We're going to have to take on all that. We cannot do that without also challenging the ideas and the shit in our heads. It is impossible for us to link arms with gay people, black people, white people on the picket lines, without challenging the homophobic and the race and all the crap that capitalism shoves in our heads to justify itself. And I'm thinking of the miners' strike. Less than 1% of the workers of this country, right? Less than 1% of the working class of this country took on the government. The government threw everything at them, the army, the police, the DSS and all the rest of it. It took them a year to beat them. At the end of that strike, the miners, that inequality I was talking about, were proud to lead the Gay Pride March. And many gay miners were able to come out for the first time. Many women, female miners, the miners' wives, came out from under that oppression. And that was just less than 1% of the working class of this country. Just imagine if 2.5% of the working class of this country started taking on the bastards. So you see the change we're going to see.
I'll come back to you with the next one.
I wanted to again return to the question of the economic organisation of production at the base of society as being the real crucial determining factor and the starting point really that I think Marxists have to have. And I think the best way to do this is to do, as some comrades have suggested, is to start and look at some of the evidence that does exist, not just for contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, but some of the other societies that have existed into the 20th century, which have retained some of the ideas and approaches towards production that hunter-gatherer communities have. And of course, those cultures are often distorted by the impact of meeting people from capitalist backgrounds or traders or war or whatever, but they still often retain many approaches. I mean, the Jesuits that Sally talked about meeting the Montagnais Indians in the 1600s was still organising on very egalitarian lines 300 years later when Bert Leacock went. And so for instance, take a group of people who lived in the South Sudan, the Noor people, studied by a wonderful series of reports by Evans Pritchard in the mid-1930s. An early pastoral society, retaining much of the egalitarian organisation of their society. What was important about that? it didn't just change their interpersonal relationships, it didn't just change how they produced or how they went and got food or how they fished and so on, it changed the very ideas in their heads. They had, I can't remember the word, I can never say that word, where you marry more than one person of the opposite sex, you know what I mean? They had female-female marriage, where a woman would take on a male role in society. Yeah, she was a woman who could have children, adopt children. Those children would then have the relationships in the wider communities as though they come from a male father. Why is this important? You see, actually, what's the key thing that happens between the transition from hunter-gatherer communities to societies where women's oppression is possible? It is actually a revolution in the mode of production. It's a transformation at the base of society. It's why Gordon Childe called it the Neolithic Revolution, because actually there's an enormous change, and it's not overnight, as some modern archaeologists pretend. It's a long, drawn-out process. It's not just that it takes place over a period of time in different parts of the world. It takes a very, very long time. And even early agricultural societies retain much of that egalitarian background. Early agriculture with a hoe, where women were at the heart of production, women's oppression didn't make sense. It's only later on, with the development of the plough, with hydraulic farming and so on, that actually women start to be really systematically excluded from the productive process. That lays the basis not simply for class society, but for women's oppression. There's a final factor as well, which I don't know if it's been mentioned yet, is once class society becomes ingrained, once there is a ruling class, that ruling class has an interest in defending and protecting its position. That's when oppression as a structure in society becomes crucial. Divide and rule. My very final point is, I was at a part of the conference in Liverpool, and I don't think we should trick ourselves into thinking that anthropologists have all become Marxists. They're materialists. They often are very, very clear materialists, and we have a lot of common with them, but we still have to struggle with them for an approach to society that I think helps us to understand the past to change the future.
It's really interesting that you talk about hunter-gatherer societies and things like that in terms of changing the modes of production and the oppression of women. I just want to sort of fix your eye on China. So culturally, I'm Chinese, and everybody that's from my generation in my family, I don't call them by like cousin this, cousin that. They're my brothers and sisters. Traditionally, in a Chinese, in the village, all the family are all in one household. So actually it gets bigger and bigger, and actually you don't know who your mother and father is. You just know who your uncles and aunts are. They all look after each other. So that's not a very long time ago. So when you actually look, I was actually watching a BBC programme a couple of days ago about this village in China who were rice paddies and things like that, and the whole village goes out to help put this new set of rice paddies, etc. But what I wanted to sort of draw your attention to in terms of like the industrialization of China is that once you get the pull of young people going into the cities, and there was this huge baby boom to the point where China decided that they wanted a one-child policy, which you all heard of in the sort of, I think, late 60s. And then we heard all these shocking stories about how boys were favoured more than girls, and baby girls were left on the side streets to sort of like die, basically, because if you had one child, you wanted that child to be a boy to take on the family name. And that is imposed by policy and by the state. This is in a world where a third of food that is produced is completely wasted, and you have people starving. You have the whole idea of state. So if you, for example, were working towards a classless society, a stateless society, where you're working towards that need, and that's when you break those barriers for that. But going backwards in time to ancient Greece, one of my favourite tragedies is Medea. The story of Medea is absolutely fantastic. So this woman, she's not a Greek, marries Jason, and Jason goes off to get basically cheated her to marry the princess, etc. But she's actually the daughter of Helios, granddaughter of Helios, the sun, and she basically was also known as a barbarian just because she was non-Greek. So again, the idea of the state, and that idea that if you're not part of the state, then you're not civilized. And also, about partners, who are you allowed to marry and not marry? So in Medea, because she was a barbarian, she didn't have the right to say, like, no, you can't go off and cheat on me and marry the princess to become king. And again, she actually, in the end, killed her children to get back at at her other half, and she actually got away with it. And the person that wrote that tragedy was actually expelled and exiled from Greece.
Yes, I want to go back to something Lionel was talking about at the first contribution. This idea that, by calling something primitive, it means somehow that we regard them as less than us, and there is a real possibility of that. But the fact is that all the evidence shows that people have been essentially just like us for the last 80,000 years, maybe longer, maybe less, I don't know. And like us, they have imaginations, they develop the world, they develop their views on the world, and they develop different ways. I mean, one of the most primitive peoples on Earth is, there's a tribe in Tierra del Fuego. So primitive that they don't have any form of shelter, they don't have the ability to sew furs together to make clothes, a truly primitive level of material culture. And yet, when anthropologists studied them, they found that these people had rituals that covered different groups and different families and bound the whole society together that went on for over a year, each performing different acts within the ritual. So it's just an example of the fact that because somebody is a hunter-gatherer, and I hate that word, hunter-gatherer, well, those two words, hunter-gatherer, because it suggests that somehow hunting is the most important part of what's happening. We know that hunting provides less than the majority of the food that provided. The gathering was the key. The gathering was what kept people together. The hunting, it provided the bonus on top of what was necessary to survive. The difficulty I have with Engels, and it comes largely from his reliance on the evidence that was presented to him, is that we have this just so story about, because men were hunters, they were the ones who were in charge of the livestock, they're the ones who therefore become the ploughman, and that gives them control over production of agriculture. I think that's a just so story. It really doesn't add up. The Aztecs had a class society. They had no animals bigger than chickens and little dogs. I don't think they were all chihuahuas, but you know what I'm saying. So there is scope there, I believe, for serious research to actually identify the mechanism by which, when you get class society, you always get the women oppressed. It's never any different. So there must be some common feature across those societies. And I think it's something we need to look into more seriously. And it will repay research, because if we don't have a valid explanation for why, a materialist explanation for why women are always oppressed in class societies, then the other explanation becomes because that's what men do. And I don't think that could be right either.
Thank you. I'll try and squeeze one more different onto that.
Well, just really quickly to the last point, I think there are three things. One is the question of descent and inheritance once you establish private property. Secondly, I think there's defence and war to defend that surplus, which excluded women. I can't remember the third one I said, but there's another one. But that wasn't the main point I wanted. The fact that you have no control over your facility. And I think those three things combined, to me, explains it. But I really wanted to come to the woman who was asked about what would the future be like, and really what the point of talking about Engels at all. I was actually fortunate enough to be taught by Lionel here a module on Evelyn Reid, women's evolution. And to be honest, it was one of the most important things in my life. I was thinking about that today, Lionel, before I saw you, because it really it was so, I can't tell you how exciting it was. One, to realise that for 90% of human existence, egalitarianism of some sort had been the norm. Because we are told day after day after day that inherently human beings are selfish and socialism is impossible. So that was amazing to find that this had been written by somebody. There was evidence to show that we had lived a different way. The second thing is really about the way that women's oppression is located in the family. I mean, why was it a revelation? It was obvious to me as a girl growing up in a working class family that my mother was oppressed because of the privatised reproduction of labour that took place. Now, the important thing also is, if you take Engels as your base, you can understand all of the changes that have taken place in the family from the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, when Engels and Marx thought the family was going to probably disappear as women and the children were pulled into the labour force. You can also understand the importance of the family today in keeping oppression and difference between men and women, that the family is always used by the ruling class as a reactionary tool to separate men and women, because for us, the unity of the class and the ruling class understand that that's important, that once when men and women fight together and they eradicate those divisions, the ruling class has a problem. But I also think, I would say to you, that all revolutions have changed human relationships. And the great thing, Lenin called a revolution the festival of the oppressed. And the difference for us is going to be, we are going to be having that revolution and having that socialist society afterwards, in a society where we have the technology in order to produce plenty. There won't be scarcity under socialism, and I think that will eradicate the need for many of the inequalities that exist today.
I just wanted to answer a couple of questions, actually. That one was about the sexism of ancient biblical societies, and the point about them is actually they're not very old. The books were written first. They were written down long after the stories begin, but they're only about 3,000 years old. 3,000 years old?
Yeah.
Going backwards about that. And they're based on stories that are another couple of thousand years old. And the point is that they are firmly class societies. They are, whether it's in the cities, on the plains, or whether it's the nomadic shepherd communities, they are, they are part of empires and they have kings. There is nothing sort of egalitarian about these places at all. And the second thing was just about how do men change? How do people change? How do we get rid of what Marx called the muck of ages and all the sexism and homophobia and racism crap? And when we fight against it amongst us within ourselves, and we challenge our own ideas, there's still lots of stereotypes and all the rest of it. And the point is class struggle. And this is how, in something, a massive great upsurge like the Paris Commune in 1871, this is how women won equal pay with men. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. This is 1871 in Paris, for God's sakes. And it's purely off the back of a massive upsurge of class struggle, but even something that wasn't on the scale of a revolution like that, in the miners' strike that you mentioned. When the miners' strike began, they had a page 3 woman, naked from the waist up in their miners' paper. Well, as the strike goes on, there's all the stuff about, the legal stuff about the miners can't picket and stuff, so the women start picketing, and the women are going around the country raising money, public speaking, they are doing all this stuff. And of course, what happens is that the ideas no longer fit. You can't treat women like this. You can't see them as sexual objects and as just, objects, if they are doing all this stuff and constantly challenging your ideas about them. And of course, the thing was that miners simply got rid of the page 3 woman and stuff. And that was not a revolution. But that was a year-long strike in which they challenged the state, and it was a massive fight. And that's where it begins.
Just quickly pick up on the point about monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Corey is quite right. I just want to say back that up. Actually, if you look at in ancient Egypt, with the assertion, with the Altanism, when you first get the arising of the idea of a single God, there was actually a massive ideological attack on mother right that had gone before, and the models of the female is very powerful. And in fact, the Egyptians produced statues of men with extremely large members, which horrified the Victorians when they found them around chopping them all off again. So, I mean, I think Campbell's quite right, that this is a class society. It has been, but there was a conscious effort to not only materially but ideologically defeat the previous mother rights and the ideologies that went with that. Just one other thing I want to say. Malinowski, who was an anthropologist writing around before the time of the First World War, talks about the Trobriand Islands, writes extensively about the horticulturalists of the Trobriand Islands. And what's interesting about that is that they are in a process of transition. So, for example, some of the larger vessels used for fishing are actually collectively owned. Some of the medium-sized ones are privately owned, if you like, by the headman or whatever. The headman often has collects the surplus. And it's interesting in transition. One of the funny things about it, if you read it, he talks about women as actually being very empowered. It's a very funny little story he tells about a man running through a place where women are collecting stuff and having his covering removed by them in a sort of whatever. But what he's illustrated is the sexual confidence of the women. He suddenly then realises that he's actually saying, this actually looks quite good, this actually looks quite a nice society. And then goes on in a diatribe to reassert the centrality and the inevitability of the monogamous family. I mean, actually, there was something rather wonderful about these societies, and we shouldn't forget that, and that was destroyed with the rise of class society, and that is rooted in the economic changes within society.
Okay, yeah, thanks everyone, that's really interesting. I want to start from the question of the new evidence and stuff, because, yeah, I was at the public lecture at that conference as well in Liverpool, where there was a number of anthropologists from different viewpoints talking about, it was kind of meant to be a public lecture. I think me and Martin were the only public who were there and everyone else was participants, but it was basically about, are human beings selfish, are they too selfish to live together, and that kind of common question that I'm sure we've all come up against in discussions. And it was really clear that there was no question that the evidence shows that all kinds of claims of naked apes and violent beasts and all these kind of things that people have been said to be through the decades, there's simply no evidence for it. That all the evidence, or the vast majority of the evidence suggests that people in the past, and people actually largely, up until recently, living in hunting and gathering societies and so on, mostly got along most of the time. There wasn't, warfare in societies that didn't have kind of elites, as they called them. They didn't really talk in terms of class. And that there were conflicts, but the conflicts were about, personal issues. You nicked my whatever, pendant that I was playing with, or you did this, or kind of personal misdeeds that were done to each other. And that these conflicts were resolved, not violently, but through mediation most of the time, through, ritualistic kind of non-violent fighting that no one would get hurt, but you'd get out your annoyance at the other person. All kinds of things that sounded very useful, actually, for all kinds of situations I can think of that might resolve things without resorting to violence. And it just showed that there was, there's absolutely no question, And so it's interesting, though, that when Martin asked the question, so what was it that fundamentally changed then? Why did we go from these kind of societies to societies in which there is conflict and there is war and there is, that are characterised by violence and inequality and so on? They literally could not answer it. It's like they almost couldn't hear it, let alone answer it. They could not come up with some kind of explanation. They can look at evidence and recount evidence and give you statistics and so on, but they literally could not, come up with a human explanation for what might have happened to change things so fundamentally, at different times in different ways, but basically all across the globe. And so I think it is, it's absolutely right that people actually, I think in the past, if you read Chris Harman's article, whenever that was, a lot of it is defending the evidence, that Engels uses and showing, yes, of course, there's this problem with the evidence, this problem, but we can still say this or this. Actually, that's not the argument today, I think. Colin brought up an argument about the method, and some of the arguments in Heather Brown's book and in these Fogel and Jimenez, None of them attack Engels on the basis of anthropological evidence, because I just don't think you can. You know, there's so much evidence for the truth of what he's arguing. But there is an attack on him in terms of his method. You know, for some people he's not Marxist enough, for other people obviously he's too Marxist, and you know, and so on. But you know, I think it is really important to engage with those kind of arguments that are coming up around the Marxist method and historical materialism, really, and how we understand human societies and how they change. But it's important, you know, because one of the points that that Heather Brown makes, and that someone raised really, is, you know, there's lots of evidence that supports the notion of primitive communism or communism or whatever we want to call it. But there is hardly any research done from the perspective of what's happened to women in societies through those times, because no one seems to be particularly bothered about that question, except actually people who are on the left and are fighting oppression. And, you know, Heather Brown, she's not an anthropologist. She is someone who's coming from a philosophical, you know, a political theory background, and really struggling to find, you know, anthropologists who are actually doing work looking at the evidence that does exist, but trying to understand it from the perspective of women's oppression. And so I think, yes, there does need to be more research. But, you know, I agree with what speakers said, that I actually think, you know, the argument in its core is already convincing. And I think, you know, it would be brilliant to have new research to back it up and to look in more detail at exactly how, you know, this process has affected women over history. Now, I guess the other thing I wanted to come to is the question of, you know, how do people change, really? Will men become nicer, you know, and so on? And I think, you know, it is really clear that human beings, you know, behave in the ways we do because of the kind of societies that we live in. You know, when we went to the Ice Age art exhibition, you can see just from the kind of art that they produced, the way that people were valued inside of those societies. And it wasn't just the women. There was the tiny little portrait of a kind of a facial disfigurement, wasn't there? A woman or a figure who had a kind of you know, drooping eye, and someone who was clearly, in fact, all the figures, none of them had faces. You know, they were all quite abstract in a way. They're all kind of exaggerated physical forms of women, except for this one portrait of a face, which is like tiny but intricately carved into a little pebble. And it shows this person who clearly, you know, was held in, obviously speculation, held in some kind of regard in that society. You know, this would have taken several hundred hours to carve this thing. They've done tests to try and recreate these kind of carvings they did. It's not something you do in order to take the mick out of someone or to laugh about them. It's something that has some kind of importance. And, you know, there was, I was speaking to someone the other day who was talking to a curator at the Natural History Museum about disability in pre-class societies, and how anthropological evidence of, you know, literally human bones that have been found that are clearly people who had severe disabilities but who lived to an old age. You know, they weren't left to die on a hillside, like, you know, or whatever we might imagine people used to do. They weren't allowed to just fade away. There were people who were looked after, who were part of a society much more than the way that people with disabilities are treated today, really. And so I think we can see how transformations, the sort of thing that people have talked about in the discussion, how people can transform themselves, because it's not just changing the conditions, it's changing ourselves in the course of doing that. You know, the new generation that Engels is talking about, who won't understand any of these kind of human relations, you know, that are so distorted that we have today, they won't be the ones who actually go through the process of that revolution in a way. They won't be the ones who've had to rid themselves of the muck of ages. They'll be the ones born after who never knew about the muck of ages, that it's just some kind of history to them, and they'll be having a meeting about, you know, the just so stories of this crazy society with inequality and oppression and so on. You know, so it's about how we go from a position of being as distorted as we are, but still being able to see a future that is different. And you know, that's the contradiction that we're always caught in as human beings and as revolutionaries. You know, but that's the contradiction, you know, in which the kind of the thing is, you know, the revolution is. It's in having a vision of something and, you know, allowing that really through communal action by acting together to take us over all of the distortions that we currently face.